She came for help at the point where most people would already be unconscious. Every step into the building cost her something. Blood had soaked through the makeshift wrappings hours ago, dried, then broken open again with movement. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from exhaustion layered on top of pain that had been ignored for too long. She did not announce herself. She did not demand attention. She stood there, leaning against the wall, waiting for someone to notice that staying upright was already an effort. The waiting room was loud in small, ordinary ways. Phones chimed. Someone complained about the air conditioning. A television played a daytime show no one was watching. She did not fit into that space. Her clothes were torn and stained. Her boots left faint marks on the floor. When she finally reached the counter, the person behind it looked up, then immediately looked past her, as if hoping someone else would step forward instead. Questions were asked, but not the kind meant to help. Where was her ID? Why was she dressed like that? What happened to her? She answered only what she could. Her voice was low, clipped, each word measured. She said she was injured. She said she needed treatment. She did not explain further. She had been trained not to explain, trained to endure, trained to keep moving until the job was done. The response was hesitation, then annoyance. She was told to sit. She was told to wait. Minutes passed, then more. Her vision narrowed, the edges of the room blurring in and out. She adjusted her stance to keep pressure on a wound that should have been stitched hours ago. No one offered water. No one asked if she was about to pass out. The assumption had already been made. A nurse walked by and slowed, eyes flicking over the blood, the posture, the way she scanned exits even while barely standing. The look was not concern. It was caution. Another staff member whispered something that ended with a shrug. Policies were cited. Liability was mentioned. Someone said she could be unstable. Someone else said they did not know what she was mixed up in. The words piled up, each one making it easier to do nothing. When she leaned forward onto the counter to steady herself, the decision was made. They told her they could not treat her without proper documentation. They told her to go somewhere else. They said it would be best if she left. The tone was firm, rehearsed, as if they had practiced saying no often enough that it no longer felt personal. She nodded once. No argument. No anger. Just a small acknowledgement, the kind that comes from someone used to orders. She turned toward the door, every movement slower now. The automatic doors did not open fast enough, and she had to brace herself against the glass. Outside, the air was colder. Her knees buckled slightly, then locked again. She made it a few steps before stopping, breathing shallow, jaw clenched to keep control. From the inside, someone watched her go and felt a flicker of relief. A problem removed. A situation avoided. The waiting room noise resumed. The television laughed at something. A name was called for the next appointment. She stood just beyond the doors, swaying, trying to decide if she could make it to the curb. The world tilted. Her hand slid along the wall, leaving a dark smear. She focused on staying conscious, on keeping pressure where it mattered, on the simple rule drilled into her long ago that stopping meant failing. No one followed her. No one called out. The building behind her continued as if nothing unusual had happened, as if turning away someone bleeding had been a minor administrative choice rather than a human one. And as she took another step forward, her vision dimmed again, the sounds around her fading into a distant hum as her body finally began to give in to what it had been holding back for far too long. The first thing they noticed was not the injury. It was the way she looked. Mud ground into the fabric of her clothes. Dried blood stiffening the sleeves. Hair pulled back in a rough tie that had come loose hours ago. She did not match the image they were used to seeing when someone needed care. There was no clean shirt, no clear story, no visible sign that fit neatly into a familiar category. Their eyes moved quickly, taking inventory without empathy. Too rough, too unfamiliar, too hard to place. They read her appearance as a warning rather than a signal of distress. The way she stood, shoulders squared despite the tremor in her legs, was interpreted as aggression. The quiet control in her face looked like defiance. They saw someone who might cause trouble, not someone barely holding herself together. She noticed the shift immediately, the slight stiffening of posture, the guarded tone, the way questions came sharp and short instead of calm and careful. She had seen this look before in border towns, in temporary checkpoints, in places where survival depended on how well you hid what you were. She adjusted instinctively, saying less, moving slower, trying not to draw attention to the blood seeping through the bandage at her side. The contrast between what they saw and what was happening inside her body could not have been wider. Muscles were locking from strain. Her pulse thudded unevenly in her ears. Pain flared and receded in waves, controlled only by discipline and habit. Each breath required calculation. But pain like that leaves no obvious mark on the face of someone trained to function through it. To them, she looked capable. Capable meant not urgent. Capable meant she could wait. Capable meant someone else would be a higher priority. They did not see the way her fingers curled slightly with each wave of dizziness. They did not notice how she shifted her weight to protect one side. They did not hear the faint hitch in her breathing between sentences. Assumptions settled in quietly. Maybe she had been in a fight. Maybe she was intoxicated. Maybe she was homeless. Maybe she was dangerous. None of these were spoken aloud, but they shaped every response. Distance replaced care. Procedure replaced judgment. The safest option, from their point of view, was to keep her at arm's length. When she was told to wait, it was not said with concern. It was said as a way to delay engagement. Time became a filter. If she stayed standing, she must not be that hurt. If she did not collapse, then she could not be critical. This logic ignored the reality that endurance often looks like strength right up until it fails. She leaned against the wall, eyes half closed, letting the cool surface support her weight. People passed by without meeting her gaze. A few glanced at the stains on her clothes, then quickly away. No one asked if she needed help sitting down. No one brought a chair closer. Her appearance had already defined the limits of their involvement. She thought briefly about explaining, about lifting the bandage, about forcing them to see what she had been containing. But training held her back. You do not reveal more than necessary. You do not expose vulnerabilities unless ordered. You handle it yourself. Those rules had kept her alive before. They were failing her now. The longer she waited, the more the room seemed to tilt. Sounds blurred together. The smell of antiseptic mixed with iron. She focused on steadying her breathing, counting in her head, grounding herself the way she had been taught. Around her, life continued at a normal pace, untouched by the quiet emergency unfolding a few feet away. Their judgment remained fixed on the surface, on the dirt, on the blood, on the posture that suggested control rather than collapse. They missed the truth hidden underneath, the reality that the body they were dismissing was operating far beyond safe limits, that the woman they were keeping at a distance was surviving on discipline alone, and that by trusting their assumptions over their responsibility, they were allowing bias to decide who deserved care and who did not. She did not cry out when the pain surged. There was no dramatic gasp, no plea for help, no visible sign that something was wrong beyond what could already be seen. Pain, to her, was not an emergency. It was a condition, something to manage, something to move through. She had learned long ago that reacting to it only made it louder, more demanding. Control was quieter. Control kept you functional. Every nerve in her body was awake. The injuries were not fresh, but they were deep, layered, complicated by time and movement. Muscle strained against damage. Skin pulled where it should not have. Each step sent a message up her spine that her body was past its limit. She acknowledged the signal, then pushed it aside. That reflex was automatic now, ingrained through years of repetition and necessity. From the outside, she looked composed. Her face was still, jaw set, eyes alert even when they flickered with fatigue. She stood straight when she could have sat. She answered questions without hesitation, without complaint. The discipline that kept her alive in hostile environments now worked against her, masking the seriousness of what she was enduring. Inside, it was a different story. Her heart rate was elevated, uneven. Blood loss had left her lightheaded, the kind of dizziness that comes in waves rather than all at once. Her hands tingled faintly, a warning sign she recognized but ignored. She shifted her stance constantly, redistributing weight to manage pain and prevent collapse, all while appearing calm to anyone watching. She was counting without realizing it. Breaths, steps, seconds between pulses of pain. Counting gave her something solid to hold on to when everything else felt unstable. It was a technique drilled into her during training, used to maintain focus under stress. She had counted in darkness, in water, under pressure. Counting now felt familiar, grounding, even as her body protested. When someone spoke sharply to her, irritation cutting through the air, she absorbed it without reaction. Emotional responses required energy she did not have to spare. Her focus was narrow, inward, centered on maintaining function. She registered tone but did not respond to it. That absence of reaction was mistaken for indifference, or worse, attitude. Pain has a way of sharpening perception even as it drains strength. She noticed details others missed. The rhythm of footsteps behind the counter. The way a door stuck slightly when opened. The smell of disinfectant layered over something metallic. These small observations anchored her, reminders that she was still present, still aware, still capable of control. What no one saw was how much effort that control required. Every muscle was tense, not with aggression, but with restraint. Her body wanted to curl inward, to protect what was injured. She forced it upright. Slouching would draw attention. Attention invited questions. Questions slowed things down. She needed treatment, not scrutiny. There were moments when her vision dimmed at the edges, when the room seemed to narrow into a tunnel. She blinked deliberately, grounding herself in physical sensation. Feet on the floor, back against the wall, fingertips pressing into fabric. She had trained through worse disorientation, through chaos and noise and fear. This was quieter, but no less dangerous. Silence became her armor. She did not explain how long she had been hurt. She did not describe the conditions she had endured. She did not list symptoms or timelines. Those details lived in her head, organized, ready if demanded, but she would not offer them freely. In her world, information was currency. You spent it carefully. As time passed, the strain showed in subtle ways. A fraction of a second longer before responding. A barely noticeable sway when she shifted her weight. A tightening around the eyes that hinted at effort rather than calm. These signs went unnoticed, dismissed as impatience or fatigue rather than warning signals. Her strength was not loud. It did not announce itself. It existed in restraint, in the ability to remain functional under pressure, in the refusal to let pain dictate behavior. That same strength now kept her from collapsing outright. Even as her body moved closer to the edge, holding on through discipline alone, waiting for relief that was not coming, enduring in silence because enduring was what she had always done. It was not the blood that stopped them. They had already seen that and chosen to look past it. It was not the way she staggered when she reached for the wall, or the faint sound her boots made as she shifted her weight to stay upright. Those signs had blended into the background, written off as inconvenience or exaggeration. What changed everything was something smaller, almost accidental. As she leaned forward, the edge of her jacket pulled back just enough to expose a strip of fabric beneath. It was worn, faded from repeated washing, but the stitching was precise, purposeful. A patch sat there, partially obscured, the thread frayed at one corner. At first glance it meant nothing. Just another piece of clothing. Just another detail in a day full of them. One person noticed it without knowing why. A pause mid-step. A second look. Something about the placement felt deliberate, not decorative. Not the kind of thing you picked up at a surplus store without understanding what it was. The letters were incomplete, but familiar in shape. Muscle memory stirred before conscious recognition. The staff member moved closer, not out of concern, but curiosity. The distance closed just enough for the symbol to come into clearer view. It was subtle, the kind of marker meant for those who knew to look for it. Not a badge, not an announcement. A quiet identifier. The sort of thing you did not wear unless you had earned it. Her posture had not changed. She still stood rigid, chin slightly lifted, eyes tracking movement in the room even as her breathing remained controlled. That, combined with the patch, created a moment of cognitive dissonance. The story they had been telling themselves no longer fit as cleanly. Questions shifted in tone. Someone asked where she got it. The answer was short, neutral, no elaboration. That only deepened the unease. People who lied usually over-explained. People who wanted attention made sure to get it. She did neither. Another staff member joined, drawn in by the pause, by the sudden stillness in a place that usually ran on routine. They followed the line of sight, noticed the same detail, felt the same flicker of recognition. The room seemed to quiet around them, not because anyone had said anything, but because something had changed beneath the surface. Someone stepped back, reassessing everything they had already decided. The blood was no longer just mess. The silence was no longer defiance. The controlled stillness was no longer suspicious. It became context. It reframed the way she stood, the way she watched, the way she conserved energy. A memory surfaced. A brother who had served. A documentary watched late at night. A briefing attended years ago. The symbol connected to training that broke people down and rebuilt them into something precise and relentless. To missions that did not exist on paper. To individuals taught to endure far beyond normal thresholds. They looked at her again, really looked this time. The way she held herself despite obvious injury. The absence of complaint. The economy of movement. These were no longer just quirks. They were indicators. Signs that had been there all along. Dismissed because they did not fit an expected narrative. The realization did not arrive with drama. It crept in quietly, bringing discomfort with it. Discomfort at how close they had come to turning away someone who had survived things they could not imagine. Discomfort at how easily they had relied on surface judgments. Discomfort at the fact that a small piece of fabric had accomplished what blood and pain had not. Procedures were suddenly flexible. Someone reached for a wheelchair that had been ignored moments earlier. A door was opened without comment. Voices dropped, not out of pity, but respect. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. She noticed it immediately. The change in body language. The way people now avoided her eyes, not out of dismissal, but uncertainty. She did not react, did not straighten or soften. She simply adjusted her stance and followed the direction given, conserving what little energy she had left. The irony was not lost on her, that it took a hidden detail to validate her suffering. That the same wounds were now urgent only because they belonged to someone with a certain background. She had seen this pattern before, in different forms, in different places. As they moved her inside, the earlier indifference hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. The detail they had finally noticed continued to echo through their thoughts, forcing a reevaluation of every assumption made in the moments before, and with it the unsettling understanding that the truth had been visible all along. Waiting quietly for someone to recognize it, the change hit them all at once, like a sudden drop in temperature. Faces that had been flat with routine stiffened. Movements slowed, then became deliberate. Someone who had been leaning casually against the counter stood up straight. Another stopped mid-sentence and did not finish the thought. The realization moved through the room without being announced. Passed silently from one person to the next. A Navy SEAL. The words did not need to be spoken to land with weight. Training videos, briefings, stories filtered through memory. Images of people pushed beyond limits most would never reach, expected to perform anyway. The idea clashed sharply with the version of her they had created moments earlier. The dissonance was uncomfortable, almost embarrassing. They looked at her again, but this time their eyes lingered. They noticed the way her gaze tracked movement with quiet precision. The way she adjusted her position to keep her balance without asking for support. The way her breathing stayed controlled even as strain showed in the tightness around her mouth. Details that had once seemed irrelevant now felt obvious. Shock showed differently on each person. One nurse's eyebrows lifted slightly before she looked away. A technician swallowed and cleared his throat for no reason. Someone else muttered an apology that was barely audible, more reflex than intention. The room had not changed, but the atmosphere had. What had felt routine now felt like a mistake unfolding in slow motion. Questions rushed in too late. How long had she been injured? Why had she waited? Why had she not said anything? The irony hung thick. She had said something. She had said she needed help. That had not been enough. Only now did they realize how close they had come to letting discipline be mistaken for resilience, silence for stability. Authority shifted subtly. No one barked orders, but roles realigned. Decisions were made faster. Someone called ahead to clear space. Someone else brought supplies without being asked. The earlier emphasis on policy faded, replaced by urgency wrapped in guilt. She did not react to the revelation. If anything, she seemed further away now, retreating inward as adrenaline bled out of her system. Recognition did not restore strength. It only changed the way others saw her. She accepted the assistance offered with the same neutrality she had shown when it was denied. A few staff members avoided her gaze entirely. It was easier not to meet the eyes of someone you had dismissed. Others watched her closely, trying to reconcile their earlier judgment with the new reality. The discomfort was palpable. They were trained to assess risk, to prioritize care, to read signs. They had failed all three. The word seal carried weight that altered perception instantly. It reframed her endurance as heroism instead of stubbornness, her silence as professionalism instead of hostility, her appearance as evidence of sacrifice instead of disorder. The wounds themselves had not changed, but their meaning had. Someone asked about her unit, then thought better of it and stopped. Someone else tried to thank her, the words awkward and misplaced. Gratitude did not fit the moment. She had not come for recognition. She had come because she was injured and needed treatment. Everything else was noise. As they moved her through the hallway, people stepped aside without being asked. Doors opened faster. Instructions were given carefully, respectfully. The contrast was stark enough to sting. She felt it even through the haze creeping at the edges of her vision. The shift in tone, the sudden care. Shock turned inward for some of them. A quiet reckoning. If this was how easily they could misjudge her, how many others had been turned away without the benefit of a revealing detail? How often did they rely on assumptions disguised as experience? The realization unsettled them because it exposed something uncomfortable. That competence can look like stability until it breaks. That pain does not always announce itself. That the people most capable of enduring are often the ones least likely to ask for help in a way that feels acceptable. She was laid back carefully, monitors attached, voices finally calm and focused. Around her, the shock lingered, not loud but heavy. The knowledge that the woman they had nearly sent away was someone trained to survive the impossible, someone who had likely kept going long after any reasonable person would have stopped, and that it had taken a title to make them see what had been in front of them the entire time the lesson did not arrive as a speech or a formal review. It settled in slowly, uncomfortably, in the quiet moments after everything else resumed. Long after she had been moved out of sight, after the rush had faded and routines tried to reassert themselves, the weight of what had happened lingered in the smallest details. People replayed the first moments in their heads. The initial glance, the tone they had used, the choice to delay, to question, to distance themselves. None of those actions had felt cruel at the time. They had felt efficient, safe, reasonable. That was what made it harder to sit with afterward. Duty, they realized, was not just about following procedure. It was about recognizing need even when it did not arrive packaged in a familiar way. They had relied on surface cues because those were faster, easier to process. Clean clothes, clear explanations, visible vulnerability. When those were absent, their instincts had defaulted to caution rather than care. Bias did not announce itself as hostility. It slipped in quietly, disguised as judgment, as experience, as pattern recognition. It whispered that this person was less urgent, less trustworthy, less deserving of immediate attention. It built a story from fragments and filled in gaps with assumption. What unsettled them most was how easily that bias had gone unnoticed. No one had stopped to say it out loud. No one had challenged it. It had simply guided decisions in the background, shaping outcomes without resistance. The system had worked exactly as designed, and that realization was deeply uncomfortable. Respect, they began to understand, should not be conditional. It should not depend on titles, uniforms, or symbols recognized only after the fact. The shift in their behavior once her identity was known exposed a hard truth. They were capable of better care all along. They had just chosen not to offer it until she was deemed worthy of it. Some of them thought about other faces they had seen over the years. People who left without treatment. People who waited too long. People who never came back. They wondered how many of those stories had ended badly not because of lack of resources, but because of misjudgment. There was also the matter of strength. They had mistaken endurance for stability. They had assumed that someone who could stand, who could speak clearly, who did not ask loudly for help, must not be in serious danger. They failed to account for the fact that some people are trained, conditioned, or forced by circumstance to hide their limits. Strength, they realized, is not proof of safety. It is often the last thing holding everything together. The quieter the suffering, the easier it is to ignore. The more controlled the person, the more invisible their crisis becomes. For a few, the lesson cut deeper. They recognized themselves in the dismissal. The way they had learned to triage not just by injury, but by comfort level. The way unfamiliarity bred distance. They had entered the profession to help, but over time, layers of protection had built up. Rules, protocols, emotional buffers, all useful, all necessary, but also capable of dulling empathy. The incident forced a reckoning with responsibility. Not legal responsibility, moral responsibility. The kind that does not appear in manuals or checklists. The responsibility to see the person in front of you before categorizing them. To question your first impression instead of trusting it. To pause long enough to ask whether hesitation is really about safety or about discomfort. No one was eager to talk about it openly. The conversations happened in fragments. A comment here, a look there, a longer pause before turning someone away the next time. Change did not arrive dramatically. It showed up as awareness. They learned that respect is not something you grant once someone proves themselves. It is something you start with, because without it, judgment fills the gap. They learned that duty is not fulfilled by process alone. And they learned that the cost of these lessons is often paid by someone else first. The memory of her stayed with them not because of who she was, but because of how close they had come to failing her, and how easily it could happen again if they did not carry that discomfort forward into every future decision, every first glance, every moment where someone stands in front of them asking for help in a way that does not fit expectations.